$20 says the new nurse quits within a week. These veteran types can't handle real medicine. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 17 minutes before Megan O'Brien documented the vitals that would later save a man's life. St. Michael's Hospital in Houston hums with fluorescent lights and the sharp tang of antiseptic that clings to everything: skin, scrubs, the air itself. The ICU runs on rhythm, beep of monitors, whoosh of ventilators, the soft padding of shoes on linoleum. Megan moves through this landscape with a kind of invisibility that comes from years of being overlooked. She refills the medication cart in the staff lounge, her hands moving with mechanical precision, counting pills, logging times, her body present but her mind elsewhere. The lounge smells like cold coffee and the acrid burn of a microwave heating something no one should eat. Dr. Whitfield leans against the counter, his white coat pristine, his voice loud enough for the 3 residents trailing behind him to hear. He taps his coffee cup against the rim of the trash can. New girl on the floor. Megan something. I give her 7 days. 8 if she's stubborn. He grins at the residents like he's told a joke they should find funny. Military background, I can tell by the posture. That kind always thinks the world owes them something. Hospital work breaks them quick. Real medicine. Real pressure. He chuckles. Takes a sip. Doesn't look at Megan. Megan doesn't look at him either. She moves to the next shelf, alphabetizing the bottles with a kind of focus that suggests the conversation doesn't exist in her universe. Her hands are steady. Scarred. The burn marks crawl up both forearms in patterns that suggest heat and chaos and a specific kind of survival. She wears long sleeves in Houston summer, even in the ICU where the temperature runs cold. No one asks why. What Whitfield doesn't notice, what he actively fails to see, is the tarnished challenge coin clipped to the pocket of her scrubs. The metal is weathered, its edges softened by hands that have held it through airports and insomnia and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being a ghost in your own life. The coin was forged from shrapnel and aircraft aluminum, pressed into shape by someone who swore that Megan O'Brien had saved his life on a March afternoon in Baghdad when the world was fire and sound and the weight of another human being bleeding through your hands. The soldier's name was Chen. Marcus Chen. He'd carried that coin every day for 12 years until his spine gave out, and then the coin gave out too, tarnished by sweat and blood and the passage of time. Megan clips it to her scrubs every shift. Whitfield leaves the lounge without looking back. The residents follow, their laughter trailing behind them like smoke. Megan finishes restocking the cart, then wheels it toward the ICU. The hallway stretches before her, linoleum that catches the fluorescent light, patient rooms with doors that open onto small dramas of survival. She knows these hallways. She's walked them before, in different clothes, a different life. That version of Megan seems like a story someone else told. Bed 12 sits at the far end of the ICU. The man in the bed is named Marcus Chen. His chart is thick enough that it has its own shelf in the nurse's station, organized by facility. Mercy General rejected him. Oak Creek Memorial transferred him out after 37 days. Seattle General, Chicago Memorial, Baton Rouge Regional. Megan counts the names as she flips through the pages. 15 doctors. 15 refusals. Liability concerns. Poor prognosis. Scheduling conflicts. One physician wrote in his notes, patient has no realistic pathway to meaningful recovery. Recommend comfort measures only. Another, recommend discharge to skilled nursing facility. Not appropriate ICU candidate. Marcus Chen is 28 years old. He was a Special Forces operator with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. He was also the man Megan carried 6 kilometers through Fallujah with rounds snapping past them like angry wasps, his lung punctured, his blood mixing with the dust until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She doesn't tell anyone this. Instead, she slides a fresh fur into the port on his arm. His arm is thin, atrophied from months of paralysis, but the muscle memory is there somewhere in the nerve fibers and the bone. She adjusts the oxygen saturation monitor, waits for the numbers to stabilize. 88%. Not perfect, but acceptable. She's worked with worse. She's worked in conditions where acceptable meant alive, and alive meant a victory. How are you feeling today, Mr. Chen? Her voice is quiet. Professional. The voice of someone who is just a nurse, just doing her job. He doesn't respond. His eyes don't track. The paralysis from his waist down has crept upward, claiming his voice along with his legs. But there is something in the way his eyes move, a flicker, a recognition, when she adjusts his positioning, when she speaks to him as though he is a person and not a prognosis. She's learned to read the language of people who can't speak. It's a skill that comes from paying attention when the world is falling apart. She notices his left forearm. The tattoo. It's faded, blue-black ink that's been through the elements, faded by sun and salt and the simple passage of time. Her name? Megan. Below it, in smaller letters, the date. March 17th. The day his spine shattered. The day he stopped being able to move. The day he learned how to exist in a body that wouldn't obey. Megan stops moving. For a moment, just a moment, her hands still. Then they resume their work, checking lines, adjusting machines, moving through the choreography of ICU nursing. But she's looking at the tattoo and he's looking at her, and there's recognition in the air between them like electricity before a storm. "I'm going to document your vitals," she says. "You're doing better. Holding steady at 88%. Heart rate is good. You're strong, Mr. Chen." His eyes flicker. Maybe acknowledgement. Maybe just the involuntary movement of a nervous system trying to communicate through a body that won't cooperate. She pulls up his chart on the computer at the bedside station. The entries are clinical, bloodless. Patient stable. No change in neurological status. Patient unresponsive to verbal commands. Consider long-term care placement. She scrolls backward through the entries from the 15 facilities. Each one reads like a slow goodbye. Each one is a doctor deciding that Marcus Chen is not worth saving. Megan begins to document. Her fingers move across the keyboard with the precision of someone who has learned the language of medical notation. Heart rate 74, regular sinus rhythm. Blood pressure 118/76. Oxygen saturation 88% on 2 liters. Temperature 98.3. She pauses before logging the entry, then adds a single line, patient showing improved responsiveness. Recommend continued aggressive monitoring and rehabilitation protocols. It's not much. But it's a record. Evidence that someone saw this man as something other than a statistic. Dr. Whitfield appears in the doorway of the ICU 15 minutes later, flanked by his residents, 4 of them, their white coats pristine, their notebooks ready. He moves through the space like a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. His voice has the particular cadence of someone who has never been wrong, or if he has been wrong, he's certainly never admitted it. Bed 12, Whitfield says to his residents. Chen, Marcus. Special Forces background, transferred from 3 facilities in the past 45 days. Chart is extensive. Each previous facility has determined that this patient does not meet criteria for continued acute care. The residents nod. One writes something in his notebook. Whitfield stands at the foot of the bed and looks at Marcus Chen the way a mechanic looks at a car that's not worth fixing. Paraplegia from traumatic spinal cord injury. Level T for complete. The patient's prognosis for meaningful neurological recovery is extremely poor. He turns to his residents. When a patient's condition becomes this severe, when the likelihood of recovery approaches 0, we must consider the ethical implications of continued intervention. Resources are limited. Beds are limited. We have other patients who would benefit far more from ICU placement. Megan is charting at the station, 30 feet away, but every word travels through the air like a knife. She doesn't look up. Her hands continue moving across the keyboard. Her jaw tightens, just once, barely perceptible, and then releases. The kind of control that comes from having survived things that would destroy most people. I would recommend, Whitfield continues, his voice carrying easily, that this patient be discharged to a skilled nursing facility for long-term management. There is no indication that continued acute care in this hospital would change his trajectory. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for a patient is acknowledge that their illness is beyond the scope of our intervention. One of the residents looks uncomfortable. Another nods, taking notes on exactly what the doctor is saying, learning the architecture of the argument that will allow him to refuse difficult patients without feeling guilty. Whitfield turns to leave, then pauses. His eyes land on Megan, on the challenge coin clipped to her scrubs, on the scarred hands moving across the keyboard. "Cute," he says. "The coin. Military souvenir." Megan doesn't look up from her charting. "Yes, sir." "Thought so." His smile is the kind that contains no kindness. "Did you serve, or just collect them?" She meets his eyes once. Holds the gaze long enough for him to see that the question doesn't deserve an answer. "Just charting, Dr. Whitfield." He laughs. The residents laugh. The sound carries the particular texture of people who are powerful and know it, who believe that the world has been ordered correctly by them and will remain ordered as long as they maintain their position at the top. He turns and walks out of the ICU, his white coat moving like a sail, his residents trailing behind him like smaller boats in the wake of something larger. Megan returns to her charting. But her eyes drift back to bed 12, to Marcus Chen, to the tattoo on his arm that carries her name like a prayer or a promise. 15 doctors have said no. 15 times, this man has been told that he is not worth saving. 15 times, the answer has been refusal. What Whitfield doesn't know is that someone is counting. Someone is documenting every rejection, every dismissal, every moment when a doctor with a crisp white coat decided that Marcus Chen's life was not worth the effort. What Whitfield doesn't know is that Megan O'Brien has spent the last 12 years of her life becoming someone who doesn't accept no. Someone who carries soldiers through fire. Someone whose pattern recognition skills have already begun to identify inconsistencies in his billing, discrepancies in his patient transfers, a specific architecture of refusal that suggests something far more calculated than medicine. But that wasn't the worst part of what Whitfield didn't know. The worst part was that he had just made a bet about a woman whose name was tattooed into the forearm of a man he was about to destroy. The staff lounge at St. Michael smells like burnt coffee and the particular kind of defeat that comes from 12-hour shifts. Whitfield holds court at the center table, surrounded by residents in short white coats and 2 attending physicians who should know better. Megan enters to refill her water bottle, movements economical, face neutral. "There she is," Whitfield announces, voice carrying across the room like a tank idling in a garage. "Our little G.I. Jane. Tell me, O'Brien, did they teach you how to follow orders in the military? Because in real medicine, we have something called a chain of command." The residents laugh on cue. Megan's jaw clenches once, barely visible, but she continues filling her bottle, her hands completely steady. The tap water runs cold against the plastic. She doesn't rush. She doesn't hesitate. "Yes, doctor," she says evenly, her voice the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Whitfield smirks. "That's more like it, soldier girl." 3 days later, the cafeteria during lunch rounds. Megan carries her tray past the resident's table, mac and cheese, green beans, chocolate milk in a paper carton. She doesn't see Whitfield extend his foot. The tray crashes to the floor with a wet sound of food scattering across white tile. Conversation stops dead. 40 staff members turn in synchronized silence. Silverware clatters. The milk carton splits. "Oh, I'm sorry," Whitfield says, not sorry at all, his tone dripping with theatrical concern. "Didn't see you there. You're so quiet. Like you're trying to disappear." He tosses her a napkin. It lands in the spilled food. "Clean that up, sweetheart. Wouldn't want anyone to slip and fall. Lawsuit nightmare." He leans back in his chair, supremely satisfied with himself. The attending physician studies his shoes. The residents exchange glances, some uncomfortable, some entertained. One tries to smile and fails. Megan kneels without a word, pulling the tray from the mess, collecting utensils one by one. A junior nurse, maybe third shift, maybe new, moves to help. Whitfield holds up a hand. Let her handle it. Good practice for following simple instructions. Megan wipes the floor methodically with the napkin, then stands, disposes of everything in the trash bin, and returns to her rounds without a word. Her scrubs are still spotless. Her hands don't shake. What Whitfield doesn't notice is the way she memorizes his face in that moment, not for revenge, but for the same reason a reconnaissance operator commits patrol routes to memory. Data. That's all it is. Pattern recognition. Morning rounds, day 7. Whitfield reviews Mr. Chen's chart, his expression darkening like a thunderstorm rolling in from the Gulf. Brian, explain to me why you've been documenting vitals every 2 hours instead of every 4 like I ordered. His voice has that edge to it now, the edge of a man who senses his losing control. Megan stands at the foot of the bed, hands clasped in front of her. She documented the increased frequency because Marcus Chen's heart rate had climbed from 88 to 116 beats per minute, his blood pressure rising from 120 to 138, his respirations shallow and rapid. The signs of a man whose body was failing under some invisible pressure. Patient presented tachycardia and respiratory elevation. Standard protocol, I didn't ask for your medical opinion. Whitfield cuts her off, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. I asked why you can't follow simple orders. He throws the chart at her feet. Papers scatter like snow. The attending physician suddenly finds his pager very interesting. The residents hold their breath. Pick that up, sweetheart. Megan bends, collects each page with deliberate care, stacking them in order, page 1, page 2, page 3. She doesn't rush. She doesn't fumble. Every movement precise as a surgical instrument. When she stands, the chart is perfect in her hands. Yes, doctor, she says, and her voice doesn't waver. She returns to charting as if nothing happened, her pen moving across the medication record with the steady hand of someone who has held lives together in Baghdad with nothing but pressure and prayer. What none of them see is what Megan sees. The pattern emerges during her 72-hour chart review, not because she's looking for it, but because her training won't let her stop looking. Master Chief training in operational security means you notice things. You notice patterns. You notice when the numbers don't add up. She sits in the break room at 2 in the morning with a stack of 8 weeks of billing records, and the scheme unfolds like a map of occupied territory. Routine procedure codes, 232.04 for standard blood draw. Emergency procedure codes, 232.09 for the identical blood draw, marked as critical analysis, stat request, emergency protocol. The difference in insurance reimbursement is $1,400. One procedure. One code change. Multiply that across 47 patients in 8 weeks. Multiply that by routine labs, routine imaging, routine consultations all recoded as emergencies. $2 million. Approximately. She doesn't know the exact number yet, but the pattern is clear as Baghdad's desert sun. The files contain Whitfield's billing authorizations, his signature on every inflated claim. His justifications written in clinical language that disguises simple greed as complicated medical judgment. Complex diagnostic evaluation requiring immediate turnaround, is written on a standard glucose test. Emergency cardiology consultation on a routine EKG. Her hands move across the pages, documenting everything in her personal log, dates, amounts, patient names. Her fingers don't tremble. The pen doesn't shake. A Master Chief Petty Officer trained in reconnaissance learns to process information the way a combat medic processes trauma, with complete focus and zero emotional response. Emotion is data corruption. Emotion is what gets operators killed. This is just pattern recognition. This is just seeing what's in front of her. By 4 in the morning, she has documented 117 instances of fraudulent billing across 8 weeks. By 6, she's cross-referenced the dates with Whitfield's call schedule and pharmacy records. The medications ordered don't match the diagnoses coded. The procedures documented never occurred. He's not just inflating claims, he's fabricating them entirely. Insurance fraud isn't negligence. It's not an error. It's deliberate theft from a system designed to protect people like Marcus Chen, people who have already given everything and have nothing left but the hope that someone will show up when the hospitals say no. She closes the files at 6:45. She showers. She puts on fresh scrubs. She goes to work. At 0300 hours, Marcus Chen's monitors shriek. The sound is terrifying, a high-pitched wail that cuts through the ICU like artillery. Megan is 3 steps from his bed before the night attending even looks up from his desk. The monitor shows hypertension crashing, 80/40, then 70/30. His jugular veins distend like ropes pulling tight around his neck. His skin mottles grey, then blue-grey. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid accumulating in the pericardium, compressing the heart, squeezing it until it can't beat. Fatal within minutes without intervention. Her training takes over. No fear. No hesitation. Just the calm precision of someone who has operated in worse conditions under worse pressure. She pages cardiology. No answer. She pages surgery. The operator says Dr. Stevens is in bed, not available for non-critical procedures. She pages the ICU attending. Still no answer. She pages Whitfield, he's the on-call cardiologist, and the ward clerk confirms he's in the hospital, somewhere in the building, but not responding. Megan pulls Chen's chart, flips through the consultation request section with methodical speed. Her eyes scan the dates. 15 doctors. 15 refusals documented in precise clinical language over the past month. Poor surgical candidate due to spinal injury. High perioperative risk. Recommend conservative management. Liability concerns preclude intervention. Scheduling conflict. Each refusal a small death sentence. Each doctor protecting his career, his insurance rates, his reputation while the patient drowns in his own cardiac fluid. Chen's eyes flutter open. They're panicked, dark, wide, the eyes of a man who knows his body is betraying him. He can't speak through the oxygen mask. He can't call for help. Through the ICU glass partition, Megan sees Whitfield standing in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, watching. Not entering. Not helping. Not responding to pages. Just watching with the cold curiosity of someone performing an experiment. He sees the monitors. He sees the deterioration. He does nothing. Megan checks the crash cart. The pericardiocentesis kit is there: a needle, a syringe, a guide wire, a catheter. Everything she needs. Everything that is technically outside her scope as a nurse, everything that will get her fired if she does it, everything that will absolutely save his life if she doesn't. I need some jello, she whispers to the monitor, a small dark joke from some corner of her consciousness that remembers how to survive impossible choices. Then her hands are moving, not trembling, not hesitating, and her training is taking over like muscle memory that never forgets. She preps the site with betadine, positions the needle between his 4th and 5th ribs, finds the angle and the depth that will drain the pericardium without puncturing his heart. She's performed this procedure 11 times in combat, twice in moving vehicles under fire. This is just the civilian version. Cleaner. Better lit. Less likely to explode. She slides the needle home. 60 milliliters of bloody fluid drain into the syringe. Chen's blood pressure rises immediately, 70/40, then 80/50, then 92/55. Sinus rhythm returning. His skin color shifts from gray back to pink. He exhales, and his eyes lock onto hers with recognition that transcends his paralysis. Through the glass partition, she sees Whitfield's expression shift from calculation to realization. He lowers his phone and raises it again, his finger already moving across the screen. He's making a call. The room goes so quiet you can hear the fluorescent lights hum. The monitors shrieked at 0300 hours. Marcus Chen's blood pressure collapsed to 80/40, his oxygen saturation diving like a stone thrown into dark water. The alarm rhythm was unmistakable, a pattern Megan had learned to read in the wreckage of forward operating bases where medics worked by flashlight and prayer. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the sac around his heart, crushing it with every beat. She moved before thinking. Running through the ICU corridors meant waking half the floor, but the alternative was watching a man's heart compress itself into silence. The night shift was skeletal. 2 nurses covering 30 beds. 1 respiratory therapist somewhere in the West Wing. Megan reached Chen's bedside and found herself alone. Utterly, impossibly alone. She documented it meticulously over the past month, every refusal, every page that went unanswered. 15 doctors. That number was burned into her memory with the same precision she'd memorized grid coordinates in Helmand Province. Dr. Hayes, liability concerns. Dr. Patel, poor prognosis. Dr. Brennan, scheduling conflicts. Dr. Simmons, case already assigned elsewhere, though nowhere in the chart did another attending exist. 15 men and women, each with their reasons, each turning away from the only paralyzed Special Forces veteran in this hospital who'd earned the right to demand better. The paperwork was immaculate. Her documentation was surgical. And none of it mattered at 0300 when the only person who could move was the one in scrubs nobody bothered to remember. Chen's eyes were wide, conscious, terrified. His breathing came in gasps. The monitor's rhythm was accelerating, tachycardia compensating for a failing pump. The ventilator hummed its mechanical rhythm beside him, indifferent to the crisis unfolding 3 feet away. Megan's hands moved with the kind of automaticity that only came from training, from muscle memory that transcended conscious thought. She'd performed this procedure exactly 4 times. Twice in combat. Once in a field hospital in Kandahar. Once in a trauma simulation at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth. Never in St. Michael's. Never without supervision. Never for a man whose file read like a government document someone had spent considerable effort burying. The pericardiocentesis tray was in the supply closet. Megan retrieved it in 12 seconds, she'd counted, because part of her mind had split into the compartment that tracked time while another part calculated angles and depths and the precise location where ribs would part enough to allow entry. 18-gauge needle. Sterile gloves snapping like gunshots in the silence. Her hands didn't tremble. They never did. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Restraint so perfect it looked like stone. She prepped his chest with chlorhexidine, the antiseptic smell rising sharp and metallic. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Right of the sternum. Her palms were steady against his ribs as she positioned the needle, as she began to move with the precision of someone who'd once threaded an arterial line by the light of an IED fire while counting the seconds until dust and noise became clarity. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping from around the catheter. 15 milliliters of straw-colored fluid. Then 30. The monitor's alarm changed pitch. His blood pressure started climbing. 50 milliliters. The oxygen saturation began its journey upward. 60. The monitor's rhythm normalized into something that resembled a heartbeat instead of a death rattle. 70 milliliters. 80. His breathing deepened. Gasps became breaths. By 0400 hours, Marcus Chen was stable. His blood pressure had climbed to 110/60. His oxygen sat was 94% and holding. His heart was beating with the kind of reliable cadence that made the monitor's beeping sound almost like music. Megan withdrew the needle, taped the catheter in place for ongoing drainage, and documented everything with the meticulous detail of someone who'd spent 23 years understanding that paperwork was its own form of ammunition. At 0430, she called for a bed-in step-down and watched as Chen was transferred with his improved cardiac function documented in real time. By 0600, he was awake and lucid in his new room, the drainage tube working as designed, his prognosis transformed from certain deterioration into something that resembled hope. Megan checked his vitals, adjusted his 4, and made notes in a chart that would become Exhibit A in the case against her, though she didn't know it yet. "You saved my life," Chen said, his voice thick but clear. He was studying her face with an intensity that made something in her chest tighten. "I'm just doing my job," Megan replied. Her voice was level. Professional. The voice of someone who'd never learned how to ask for credit. "I know your voice," he said. His left arm lay across the blanket. The tattoo was visible, Megan, in black block letters, surrounded by coordinates that mapped themselves onto her memory like a second skeleton. Baghdad. The grid where she'd carried him 6 kilometers with a sucking chest wound, where she'd breathed for him when his lung collapsed, where she'd sworn he'd see home again even though she was pretty sure they were both going to die in that alley. From somewhere. "But I can't." He trailed off, frustration flickering across his features. "My memory since the injury." "It's okay," Megan said quietly. "You don't have to remember." By 0700, her incident report was submitted to the nursing supervisor. Pericardiocentesis performed. Cardiac tamponade drainage. Emergency intervention due to absence of on-call physician. Patient outcome, stable and improving. The facts were clean. The documentation was flawless. And somewhere in a St. Michael's office on the 4th floor, Whitfield was already making calls. At 0800, he contacted Patricia Edmonds, the board chair whose husband's surgical center received referrals from his practice with the regularity of a pension plan. "We have a liability issue," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that came from knowing he would be listened to. "A nurse practicing medicine without supervision. Emergency procedure she wasn't qualified to perform. I need an external review." The words were crafted with precision. Liability. Qualification. Emergency. Each one a brick in a wall designed to bury someone who'd just saved a life. Call 2 came at 0815. Medical Staffing Agency. Employment verification for Megan O'Brien. Had she ever worked there before? The agency consulted their database. No record. No previous employment history. No background file. Because the woman who'd carried Marcus Chen through Baghdad didn't officially exist anymore. The Navy had erased her. Declared her KIA 8 years ago. Given her a new social security number and explicit orders never to surface under her real credentials. She was a ghost who paid taxes and wore scrubs and kept a tarnished challenge coin in her locker for reasons nobody would ever understand if they bothered to ask. By 0900, Whitfield had compiled a disciplinary file. Failure to follow orders. Insubordination. Practicing beyond scope. He backdated 3 written warnings. He included incident reports that had never been filed. He created a narrative of recklessness and disregard that transformed an act of medicine into an act of criminal negligence. His file was a work of art, the kind of meticulous fabrication that only someone who understood institutional power could construct. By 1000, an external investigator arrived, someone who owed Whitfield a favor from a time neither of them discussed. At 1100, security received termination orders. The paperwork was already prepared. The decision had been made before Megan's incident report was even printed. All that remained was the extraction. By noon, she was escorted from the building with a termination letter citing insubordination and practicing beyond scope. Her badge was deactivated. Her parking pass was revoked. Her scrubs were still wet from Chen's procedure. She didn't protest. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply walked out into the Houston afternoon with the kind of composure that only came from having survived far worse than losing a job at a hospital that would forget her by Monday. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part waited at home, at a kitchen table where her 12-year-old son was doing homework, where she would have to explain why the job she'd promised would finally stick had dissolved in less than 24 hours. The worst part was the lie she would have to construct, the story about budget cuts and staffing changes, all the comfortable facades that parents tell their children when the world proves itself to be exactly as cruel as she'd always known it was. What happened next would change everything. But first, There was rain. And silence. And a boy who needed his mother to be something she'd stopped being a very long time ago. The cardiac monitor beeped its steady rhythm through the ICU glass as Megan stepped back from Marcus Chen's bedside. The needle was out. The fluid was drained. His oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 84 to 91%, each number a small miracle nobody had been willing to give him. His chest rose and fell with easier breath. Sinus rhythm. Stable. Alive because one nurse refused what 15 doctors had already decided. Dr. Whitfield stood outside the glass doors, watching her work through the reinforced pain. His expression didn't shift. His jaw didn't clench. He simply reached into his white coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and began typing. His fingers moved with the precision of a man executing a plan that had been forming since the moment she'd walked into his hospital 2 weeks ago. The challenge coin was still clipped to her scrubs. He'd seen it. He'd marked it. And now he was going to erase her? By 6 a.m., he'd made 3 calls. The first was to Patricia Edmonds, the hospital board chair, a woman whose daughter's pediatrics practice Whitfield had steered 17 wealthy families toward over the past 4 years. "We have a compliance issue," he'd told her, his voice smooth as surgical silk. The new nurse performed a procedure without physician authorization. Cardiac intervention. She's practicing medicine. Patricia had listened. Patricia had taken notes. The second call went to Richard Hayes, the risk management director, who'd recently approved Whitfield's request for a $400,000 equipment grant. "I need you to bring in an external investigator," Whitfield said. "Quietly. The documentation will follow." Hayes had made 3 more calls before 7 a.m. The third call was different. Whitfield had contacted a staffing agency in San Antonio, impersonated hospital HR, and requested verification of employment for someone named Megan O'Brien, claiming she'd listed St. Michael's as a previous employer on a job application. The agency had no record. There was no previous job. Which meant her references were fabricated, her resume was false, and her credentials couldn't be verified. By 8 a.m., Whitfield sat in his office with a Red Bull and a laptop, drafting charges. Insubordination. Practicing medicine without a license. Inability to verify credentials. Failure to follow chain of command. Each line was careful, measured, professional. He wasn't ranting or accusing. He was building architecture. He was constructing something that looked like institutional process, like due diligence, like the kind of thing that happened when someone's background didn't check out and their judgment was questionable and maybe, just maybe, she'd never been qualified in the first place. The external investigator arrived at 10 a.m. New hire, eager, hungry. Whitfield handed him the file. "Just a preliminary review," he'd said. "Don't want to rush to judgment. But the timeline concerns me. Procedure at 0300 without authorization. Then this nurse disappears for 6 hours. By the time the attending found out, the patient was already stabilized. That's not protocol. That's not chain of command. That's someone deciding they know better than the physicians." The investigator had nodded and begun reviewing the documentation. By noon, a security guard appeared at Megan's locker while she was clocking out from her shift. His name was George. He'd been Army. He'd served 14 months in Kandahar. His voice, when he spoke, was apologetic in the way only someone who'd been given an impossible task could manage. "I need your badge and your hospital keys. Now, please." Megan's hands didn't shake. Her face didn't change. She unclipped the badge from her scrubs and handed it over. The tarnished challenge coin remained clipped to her pocket. George didn't ask for it. He'd been instructed to take the hospital property. A personal item could stay. "There's paperwork for you to sign," George continued, handing her a manila folder. "Termination letter. Effective immediately. Security is escorting you from the building." She read it in the corridor. Insubordination. Practicing beyond scope of practice. Inability to verify previous employment. Inappropriate assumption of physician authority. The words were clean. Legal. Professional. They gave Whitfield exactly what he needed, documentation that looked like institutional process rather than personal destruction. She'd never told anyone about Baghdad. She'd never mentioned the Navy. Her employment records ended in a black box labeled classified. From St. Michael's perspective, she'd simply appeared one day with no verifiable background, and then overstepped her authority in a way that could expose the hospital to liability. George walked her through the main lobby at 1:41 p.m. during shift change. The 3 p.m. nurses were arriving. The 11 p.m. crew was eating lunch. 50 staff members saw her being escorted out by security. Some whispered. Most looked away. Dr. Whitfield stood near the information desk, arms crossed, watching her removal with the satisfaction of a man who'd executed a plan perfectly. His eyes met hers for exactly 2 seconds. Then he turned away, the message clear, "I won. And you're gone." Megan signed the exit paperwork at the security desk. George handed her a cardboard box containing her purse, her phone, and a pair of backup scrubs she'd left in her locker. The hospital keys were gone. The badge was gone. The access code that had opened the trauma bays and the ICU and the medication rooms was already deactivated. "I'm sorry," George said quietly. "I know you saved that patient. Everyone in the ICU knows. But this came from upstairs." She didn't respond. The trembling started in her hands as she carried the cardboard box to her car. Her apartment was a small 2-bedroom on the east side of Houston, the kind of place that cost $1,100 a month and had water stains on the ceiling but a good elementary school 3 blocks away. She'd chosen it for that reason alone. The school was the reason for everything. Danny was the reason for everything. At 1:52 p.m., Megan sat at her kitchen table in her scrubs, still damp from shift, the termination letter spread in front of her like an indictment. The tarnished challenge coin lay beside it. Both objects felt heavier than they should. She'd held everything together for 8 years: new identity, nursing school, single motherhood, the constant vigilance of staying hidden. She'd kept Marcus Chen alive through 3 tours of Baghdad. She'd carried her team through ambushes that should have killed them. She'd breathed for a man whose lungs had collapsed while dragging him 6 kilometers through hostile territory. That was the person she'd been. The person she'd promised herself she'd buried. But sitting here in the afternoon light, that person was gone too. The tears came quietly. No sound. Just the trembling in her hands and the salt on her cheeks and the realization that she'd failed at the one thing she'd promised Danny she wouldn't fail at anymore. The last job had ended when he'd gotten pneumonia and she'd missed 3 nights of shifts staying with him in the hospital. The job before that had ended when she'd had to take him to an emergency room at 2 a.m. and couldn't find childcare. This job was supposed to be different. This job was supposed to stick. She'd promised. At 2:11 p.m., Danny came home early from school. Half day for teacher conferences. He had his backpack and his light jacket and a project folder, and his face was open and normal until he saw her sitting at the kitchen table in her scrubs, mascara streaking, hands shaking. "Mom? Why are you home?" His voice had that careful quality kids develop when they're trying to understand something that doesn't make sense. "You said you had a double shift. You said you wouldn't be home until 9 p.m. She couldn't explain. Couldn't tell him about Whitfield, about the fraud she'd discovered in the middle of the night, about the veteran she'd saved, about the military career she could never acknowledge. The classified operation that had killed Megan O'Brien had been buried so deep that even explaining her termination would mean revealing what she was forbidden to reveal. The Pentagon's official record still listed her as KIA. Her actual name didn't exist in any civilian database. She was a ghost who'd somehow gotten hired, somehow passed a background check that had apparently been cursory, and now she was a ghost who'd been fired. "They let me go, baby." Danny's face crumpled. His project folder fell to the floor. "But you promised this one would stick." You told me that this job was different. You said we were finally going to be okay. I know what I said. Is it because of me? Because you had to leave your last job when I got sick? No. God, no. She reached for him, but he stepped back, not angry, just confused and hurt in the way only a 12-year-old could be, old enough to understand loss, young enough to not understand why adults let things fall apart. He went to his room. The door closed softly. More terrible than a slam because it meant resignation. It meant he'd already learned not to expect things to work out. Megan sat at the table until dark. The challenge coin lay in her palm, so heavy it felt like it might pull her through the floor. Marcus Chen's face was engraved in the metal if she looked close enough. The call sign underneath, Reaper 6. That was who she'd been. That was who they'd sent into Baghdad when everything had already gone wrong. That was who'd refused to let men die when other people had decided they were already dead. She'd spent 8 years trying to be someone else. 48 hours later, the St. Michael's Hospital Board convened an emergency session. Patricia Edmonds presided from the head of a polished mahogany table. 15 board members, hospital counsel, risk management. The external investigator's preliminary report was in front of them. Red flags. Credential verification issues. Scope of practice violations. Dr. Whitfield sat near the front, his posture relaxed, his expression confident. He provided everything. He'd built something airtight. The conference room door opened. A 12-year-old boy walked in carrying a wooden presentation case, his hands trembling, his voice shaking with the kind of nervousness that only comes from doing something terrifying and necessary. Behind him, rolling his wheelchair slowly, was Marcus Chen. "Excuse me," Patricia Edmonds said. "Young man, this is a closed meeting. You need to." "I'm Danny O'Brien," the boy interrupted. His voice cracked. "That nurse you fired is my mom. She wouldn't show you these. But they need to see them." He opened the case. 48 hours. That was all the time Danny needed to find the wooden case in his mother's closet, the one she'd kept sealed since Baghdad, since before he was even born. He carried it into the St. Michael's Hospital Board conference room on a Tuesday morning at 9:36 a.m., his hands trembling in a way his mother's never would. The room fell silent the moment he walked through the door. Board members looked up from their agendas. Patricia Edmonds froze mid-sip of her coffee. Danny's voice cracked as he spoke. "Mom, they need to see these." He opened the case. Navy Cross. Silver Star. Master Chief Petty Officer insignia, the anchors catching the fluorescent light like they'd been waiting 8 years for this moment. The medals lay in precise formation, each on its own velvet bed, each one representing a decision that cost everything. The room didn't just fall silent, the silence became a physical thing, the kind of quiet that happens when people realize they've been standing next to someone they couldn't see. Marcus Chen's wheelchair sat angled toward the board table. His eyes found the medals first, then traveled upward to Danny's face, then to the empty chair where his nurse should have been. When he spoke, his voice came out thin and precise, a man who'd learned to use words like ammunition. "That's Reaper 6. The veteran security guard at the back of the room, a man named Clayton who'd served 3 tours in Helmand Province, moved to attention. His hand rose not quite to a salute, but close enough. "Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, United States Navy Special Warfare." The words hung in the air like a call sign being transmitted across an ocean. Admiral James Keller stepped forward from where he'd been standing in the corner all along, present but unannounced, his dress white immaculate, his chest a constellation of medals that made the ones in the wooden case look like rehearsals for the real thing. He carried a classified file folder marked with a red stripe. When he opened it, he didn't read from notes. He knew these facts the way men know the names of soldiers they've buried. Master Chief O'Brien completed 3 active deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan between 2015 and 2018. She participated in 47 direct combat rescue operations. She was officially listed as killed in action in 2017 following the extraction of 12 soldiers from a Taliban stronghold. That operation was successful. Those 12 soldiers went home. Keller paused. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The extraction was conducted by one Navy SEAL Team 3 operative working alone. Designation, Reaper 6. She carried the last soldier 6 kilometers under sustained fire with a sucking chest wound. That soldier's name is Marcus Chen. Marcus lifted his sleeve. There, on the inside of his forearm, in ink that had faded from black to gray over 8 years, was a name. Megan. Underneath it, coordinates. Underneath that, a date. 2017, the day he stopped being able to remember her face and became unable to forget it. You tried to have her terminated, Keller continued, turning to look at Dr. Whitfield, who'd gone the color of old medical gloves. You attempted to manufacture cause for her dismissal to prevent her from documenting your fraud scheme. When your initial strategy failed, when she performed an unauthorized procedure that saved Mr. Chen's life despite your explicit instructions to the contrary, you moved to Phase 2. Fabricated employment history. Backdated disciplinary warnings. Contact with references at employers that don't exist. FBI Special Agent Maria Torres stepped forward from the same corner, her credentials catching the light. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Dr. Whitfield, your attempt to falsify Master Chief O'Brien's personnel records triggered a federal investigation into St. Michael's billing practices. The investigation uncovered $2 million in fraudulent insurance claims spanning the past 6 years. Routine procedures marked as emergency surgeries. Healthy patients coded as critical. All of it traced back to you. The handcuffs came out the way retribution always does, quietly, with ceremony. Whitfield stood, his chair scraping against tile with a sound like fingernails dragging. This is absurd. I was protecting the hospital. You were protecting yourself, Keller interrupted. His voice had the weight of command, the kind of authority that comes from having ordered men into impossible situations and brought them back alive. Master Chief O'Brien documented your scheme. You recognized the threat. When you couldn't verify her employment history because her records are classified, Torres continued, you should have contacted federal authorities. Instead, you fabricated documentation. You submitted false reports to the board. You obstructed an investigation to cover your tracks. Whitfield's mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish recognizing too late that it's out of water. The confidence that had carried him through 8 years of small cruelties, of pushing trays off tables and throwing charts at floors, evaporated. What remained was a man watching his careful architecture collapse in real time. You don't understand. I have patients who need me. I built this department. Your patients needed you 2 nights ago, Marcus Chen said quietly. His voice was thin, but it carried the weight of someone who'd lived in that moment for 8 years. 15 doctors refused my case. Every single one worried about liability more than my life. She didn't. The word 15 hung in the room like a countdown to 0. Torres pulled out the handcuffs. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, falsification of medical records, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The click of the cuffs was soft, almost intimate. Whitfield's carefully constructed persona shattered in that moment the way glass shatters, suddenly and completely, with no way to become whole again. The agents walked him toward the door, and as they passed the table where his fabricated disciplinary file lay, the backdated warnings, the false reports, the manufactured evidence that triggered federal attention, staff members gathered in the hallway, phones recording, the moment already becoming viral, already becoming the story that would follow him forever. Through the glass conference room doors, Whitfield's perp walk played out for the nurses and residents and ancillary staff, and it would play out again on local news at 5, and again on the internet, a man in an orange prison jumpsuit walking toward a van, his career in medicine finished not with a bang but with the quiet finality of federal charges and 15 years of sentencing guidelines everyone knew he wouldn't survive intact. 6 months later. Marcus Chen's rehabilitation room overlooked the Houston skyline, the view better than the one in the ICU, the machines fewer, the monitors quieter. He sat upright in bed, actually upright now, not propped at an angle, not suspended in that between state of paralysis. His right hand rested on the blanket, and 3 fingers moved through physical therapy exercises with the concentration of a man learning to be human again. His left leg could feel sensation. Sensation meant recovery. Recovery meant the 15 doctors who'd refused him had been proven wrong by one nurse who'd refused to let them be right. Megan O'Brien stood beside his bed, checking his chart with the same efficiency she'd brought to every task for 6 months. But now she wore her Master Chief Petty Officer anchors pinned openly to her scrub collar. No hiding. No invisible. The transformation was complete the way only true things are, not gradual, but suddenly, all at once, the way dawn happens. On the television mounted to the wall, local news footage played on silent. Dr. Whitfield in an orange prison jumpsuit, handcuffed between 2 federal marshals, walking toward a courthouse. The news crawler read, "Guilty on all counts. 15 years federal prison. Medical license permanently revoked. $2 million in restitution ordered." The man who'd spent 8 years humiliating a woman he couldn't see would spend the next 15 years teaching CPR basics at Houston Community College for minimum wage as part of his post-release probation conditions, teaching people how to save lives while his own career remained dead. Marcus turned off the television. Does it feel good? Watching him fall. Megan considered the question the way she considered everything, fully, without rushing. It feels like justice. Not the same thing as good. Danny appeared in the doorway then, backpack over his shoulder, home from West Side Middle School. He wore a navy t-shirt now, the kind of thing that would have embarrassed him 6 months ago, when his mother was invisible and he couldn't explain who she was. Now he wore it like a flag. Like a promise kept. "Mom, Coach wants to know if you can come to career day." Megan smiled. It was a different smile than the ones from before, not guarded, not measured. "And say what?" "That I hid who I was for 8 years. That you did what was right even when it cost you everything," Marcus said. "Twice." Admiral Keller entered without knocking, the privilege of rank. He carried official documentation, the Navy's formal recognition of her service, the removal of the classified designation, the restoration of her name to the active records database. No more killed in action. No more erased. No more invisible. "Master Chief," Keller said, extending his hand. Megan shook it, her grip firm, her hands steady in the way they'd always been, steady in the way that comes from having held people together when everything else was falling apart. "Welcome back." Through the window, St. Michael's Hospital continued its daily rhythm, doctors on rounds, nurses at stations, patients in beds. But new protocols now hung in the ICU, laminated and bolted to the walls, patient advocacy above institutional liability. 15 doctors' refusals. 1 nurse's courage. A man learning to move his fingers again. The kind of mathematics that changes everything. Megan retrieved the tarnished challenge coin from her locker, the one Marcus had pressed into her hand in Baghdad 8 years ago when he promised never to forget her, when he couldn't know that she'd have to forget herself to survive. She clipped it back onto her scrubs where it had been meant to stay all along, visible now, no longer hidden, no longer a secret thing clutched in darkness. "Ready to go home?" Danny asked. "Almost." She turned to Marcus. "Same time tomorrow?" "Wouldn't miss it." His 3 fingers found her hand, squeezed gently. "Hey, Reaper 6?" Megan turned. The light from the window caught her Master Chief anchors, made them shine like they were new. "The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together," Marcus said. "Thank you for holding me together." "Again." Megan nodded once, the way a Master Chief acknowledges a soldier, the kind of nod that says everything that needs saying. She walked out with her son beside her, no longer hiding, no longer invisible, finally allowed to be exactly who she'd always been. The challenge coin caught the light one more time before the door closed behind them. If you've made it this far, you know the truth, the quiet person in your life might be carrying more than anyone realizes. If you like this story, subscribe for more narratives about hidden strength, about the people who do the right thing when no one's watching. Leave a comment. Tell us about someone quiet who changed everything. And share this with someone who needs to remember that their value isn't measured by how much noise they make.